And we are on air. Welcome back to Student Affairs Live, the weekly web show for student affairs professionals in higher education. I'm your host, Tony Doody. I'm pleased to be joining you from my professional home at Rutgers University. We broadcast on the Higher Ed Live network, and you can tune in to Student Affairs Live along with my good friend and colleague, Heather Shea Gasser, every other Wednesday this spring at 12 Eastern Time. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our guests, but we can't do that without first giving a shout out to the sponsors that make Student Affairs Live possible. Higher Ed Live is sponsored and produced by M. Stoner, a marketing communication firm that works with education institutions on branding, strategy, web design, and more. Student Affairs Live is also sponsored by ACPA, College Student Educators International. ACPA's strategic partnership with Higher Ed Live calls attention to the pairing of innovative professional development delivery with the strength of a renowned professional association. ACPA publishes the Journal of College Student Development and About Campus. Join ACPA in Tampa for the annual convention by clicking on the link sharing out now. Now you can join the conversation today, for those of you following along on Twitter, using the Higher Ed Live hashtag. And I'm fortunate to have Rutgers Interim Director of Leadership, Robin Janice, monitoring today's back channel. Thank you, Robin. And finally, I am pleased to have join me today leaders from NASPA and ACPA. Now, for the record, I'm a member of both associations, and as a point of history, my first ever NASPA and ACPA convention was 2011 in Philadelphia and Baltimore, the same year the consolidation vote. And I had an opportunity then to listen in on the town halls and talk to quite a few people on both sides of the issues. And as I went back and I reviewed the 40-page consolidation proposal for today's show, I was struck by the sheer amount of time and people that were dedicated to putting this together and exploring the potential of a unified voice. It was apparent then, and still to this day, that this is a challenging, emotional issue for many people, and I applaud and appreciate the courage and leadership of today's guests in agreeing to appear together this afternoon. So for those viewing the show, full biographies of our guests are on the Higher Ed Live website. Kevin, Cindy, Kent, and Pat, thank you for joining us. Would you all please take a moment to introduce yourself by sharing your title and role, and briefly share what you might be doing if you weren't in higher ed. We'll start off with Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindi Love, and I'm the Executive Director of ACPA. If I were not in higher education, I would be a human rights attorney.
Cool. And we'll go to Kevin next.
Hi, good afternoon. Kevin Kruger, President of NASPA. I have been at NASPA for, just finished my 20-year anniversary. Prior to that, I was a student affairs professional for about 17 years. So I'm pretty committed to the higher ed sector, but I guess if I had to pick something, I would own a restaurant and be a chef, and maybe even highlight it on Top Chef. Who knows?
Wow, what kind of food? Right. What kind of food, Kevin?
I'd probably leaning towards continental, but I love Mediterranean food. I'd probably be in a Mediterranean restaurant.
Outstanding. All right, Pat.
Pat Whitely. I am the Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of Miami. I've been there as Vice President for 18 years, and I've been at the university for 33 years. I'm currently serving as Chair of NASPA. And if I wasn't in higher ed, I'm a news junkie, so I probably would like to be something like an anchor on a news program.
So this is a perfect environment for you. You can test it out right here. Great. And Kent?
Yes, I am Kent Porterfield. I serve as the Vice President for Student Development at St. Louis University. I'm in my 9th year at the university, also serving as ACPA President. And I was... my plan when I was younger was to be a secondary school teacher and possibly a school administrator, so I'd still be bouncing around somewhere in the education world if I had chosen a different path. But I love higher education, and it's hard for me to imagine after 26, 27 years doing anything else.
Excellent. Thank you. Now, you asked me to let you know how many viewers. We've actually got over 100 live viewers right now, so let's get right into our questions. And start off with a basic question that young and even seasoned professionals often ask, and that's, what is the difference between NASPA and ACPA, and how would you distinguish your organization's niche or brand? We'll start with Kevin.
It's a great question, and certainly since this is focused around the consolidation issue. I mean, this is what kind of, I think, drove a lot of the energy around consolidation, sort of seeing some similar purpose and maybe even duplication. and it's certainly one that I think the profession has struggled with over my entire time here to some extent. I think that there's a lot of commonalities. We're the same people. I mean, the same, student affairs professionals are student affairs professionals, and so we're serving a very similar audience. And I think the themes that we pay attention to are very similar. I think you could take a look at the conference programs for ACPA and NASPA and see, as a curriculum, and see some very common themes, and then probably some places of emphasis. And I think it's the places of emphasis, perhaps, that are distinguished a little bit. I mean, I think we saw. Signature program for us. I think I would.
Kevin, we're cutting out on you a little bit. I'm gonna see if you're
represented diversity of our profession. So that's a place where I think we have devoted a lot of. Whoa, are they losing me? Did they lose me?
We got you back. We got you back.
All right. We've invested a lot in the placement exchange, which is a partnership with Hawaii, AFA, ASCA, and a variety of other associations to provide comprehensive 365 career service support. I think that's a place where there's some difference in terms of size and scope. But again, I'd say there's more similarities than differences. But running a professional association, I'd say that every day is a value proposition, right? So that some people belong to both. Some people choose one or the other, depending on what they believe that they're getting the most they get out of in terms of their own professional development. And so I'll let Cindi kind of add to how she would characterize the differences.
Great.
I've only been at ACPA since July the 1st, so my view is very different from those who have long histories, and I probably look at it more coming at my background in corporate America. And really looking at brand. And there's a great statement about brand. It actually comes from Carl Jung. It says that if you have a great brand, it has to have emotional content and all the themes of a great story. It's like mystery, magic, adventure, intrigue, conflicts, contradiction, and paradox. And when I use that kind of context for brand, it's easy for me to understand what evolved over time in the differentiation of ACPA and NASPA's brand. ACPA grew up out of counseling and human development, was founded by women. NASPA grew up out of an administration background, founded by men. The DNA of organizational cultures is always present in their branding statement. So the first thing I would say, Tony, you said the consolidation was about having a unified voice. I would counter that just a little bit. I think NASPA and ACPA must have a unified voice today. And I can have a unified voice with people in many organizations without having to belong to the same organization. So I think it's very important that we make that point in our partnership. But I also think that ACPA differentiates itself primarily around the areas of social consciousness and research and scholarship. At ACPA, my experience in the very short time I've been here, there's always a hypothesis going on. There's always a deep question being explored, and it is most often about that area of social consciousness and development. So I think that's the piece coming out of human development and counseling that influences us so much as a community. And people are going to resonate with one of those kinds of cultures. That's no different than any other place that we align ourselves with out in the world.
Excellent. Thank you. So I'm going to move on to Kent and Pat. We'll start with Kent and ask you to talk about some of the challenges of having two organizations that serve similar goals.
So it's an interesting paradox to be both a collaborator and a competitor. I think that's an interesting scenario. So it's unavoidable that we're going to duplicate effort sometimes, and some would see that as problematic, and some would see that as not so problematic. I think it's some of the challenges are that there's little question in my mind that we need to be collaborative when it serves the best interests of student affairs and higher education writ large. And while that's challenging because we're competing in some ways, some might say that competition is the best form of quality control. that, you know, competition makes us better, and if we push one another and that serves the interests of our students, our profession, and the institutions we serve, that's potentially a good thing. You know, so in the end, if those benefits are there, then I think there are some arguments to be made that sort of tension that we manage is not necessarily a bad tension. My own opinion is that it's possible to serve the same goals in different ways, and that when you think about the contested issues that we deal with, they're incredibly complex. And the opportunity for us both to approach similar issues from different perspectives, operating out of not necessarily different values, but maybe a different articulation of values, is potentially one of the strengths of having, you know, two associations. And let's remember that we're not just two. There's dozens of professional associations supporting student affairs, and sometimes their focus may be a little bit narrower than ours, but nevertheless. So in the end, for me, it's about focusing on our members and how to progressively serve them in the best way possible. If we do that from a perspective that is values-driven, and if we prioritize the things that we believe are most needed and the things that we can do very well, my guess is that we'll be okay.
Great. Pat?
I think I would absolutely agree with everything that Ken has said, and in terms of the fact that we both, ACPA and NASPA, we have our strengths, and we use those strengths to our advantage. And I think an example of our collaborative efforts is the Kent and I appointing our ACPA joint and NASPA task force on the competencies that we are doing so right now. And we're working together on that, and I think that's a great example of a value proposition that's driven by what's best for the profession right now, to update these competencies in 2015 and have that roll out in July, which we are all doing together. So I think that there's certainly room for both associations. We have at times different approaches, but we're at the same time always going to be looking to work together collaboratively on big issues that affect all of our students and all of higher education and student affairs.
Now, Tony, I would just some concrete examples of that. I think the competencies are one, but Cindi and I have came together to create a national statement on guns on campus earlier in the fall, and got other associations to join in on that. We just recently all joined in on a statement related to the UVA Rolling Stone gender-based violence issue and some of the Title IX issues. So I think there's places where I think, as Ken suggested, that there is one voice, and that one voice is important as we pull many associations together and their constituencies to speak out on a specific issue. So I think there's places where that works pretty well, actually.
Right, and I also think there's always, regardless of how the consolidation vote happened and what the decision was, there's always going to be deep respect for the leaders of both associations and wanting to collaborate and work together.
Great. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do want to give a bit of history for folks who are not quite sure what occurred 4 years ago. And it was a close vote. 81% of ACPA and 62% of the NASPA votes were for consolidation, just shy of the 66% needed. So from my perspective, it was my first year at both conventions, and as a newcomer, there seemed to be quite a bit of rhetoric, but there were also lots of salient and valid points offered on both sides of the issue. So to refresh our memory, perhaps give younger professionals a balance of the issues, could you share a few of the pros and cons that members identified at the time? We'll start with Kevin.
There was a ton of pros that were discussed. Some of it was this sort of one voice message, and we've kind of addressed that a little bit. But there was a lot of conversation about having one singular voice, and you can look at the pros and cons of that. There's a resource conversation that was discussed, that the duplication was in a time of fiscal constraints for some campuses. Many campuses felt that was a waste of resources, that we'd be better off not having 2 offices, 2 infrastructures, or those kinds of things. There was a lot about that. I think there was also a lot of energy around how we might envision, starting from the ground up, a new association with new governance and new approaches to how we would organize that would not have some of the challenges we all face with some of the artifacts of being around for 100 years or 75 years. So there was a lot of positive energy about it. On the side against, I think what I heard was comes out of the strength of both associations. There was a lot of passion about losing something that was really important to me. I was at some of the same town halls you were at, Tony, and heard people almost in tears about literally in tears, about how much they loved NASPA or ACPA and not wanting to give that up, how important that was to their professional identity, how much they grew up in that association. So there was a bit of that. There was some concern about the size. A lot of people were, hey, we don't need a conference with, 10,000 people. The joint conferences had become large, and there was some focus on both sides about whether that worked, how well that worked. There was some concern about the loss of leadership roles. That one organization, fewer opportunities to present, fewer opportunities to have leadership roles. That was a negative. And then I think the third thing was and I think it continues to be an issue. The issues affecting higher education are significant and deep. And there was a concern that the process of consolidation would take us off the beam in terms of being able addressing some of these key issues that are affecting higher education. That we would be more navel staring for a few years than we would, in fact, be working on these significant issues. So those are three themes I heard a lot of over the town hall discussions. On the plus, both the plus and the minus. And as you indicated, there was a significant amount of support on both sides.
Ken, anything to add?
That's a really good summary. I was going to say the single student affair, I'm trying to recall, single student affairs voice, leveraging of resources and strengths for greater impact. I think there was a feeling by many that at least in theory, the single association makes choice easier and addresses some affordability concerns. I think there were arguments against. Kevin has the pulse pretty well on that. I think I heard things like, well, culturally something will be lost. The things that we really appreciate about the culture of an organization in both groups, and there was a real, I think in some cases, almost a fear that there were going to be some important losses there. There was concern, I think, and a lot of discussion. I served on one of the subcommittees. There was a concern about the size of the organization and it being, folks asked, would it be too large? Right. Is it, could you steer a ship that big as nimbly as probably, we're going to be required to adapt and change in the future? And that folks felt, it's possible that larger doesn't necessarily mean greater impact. In fact, it might actually work the other way if we aren't able to move as quickly. I will tell you that I think that emotions were really engaged, and anytime emotions are engaged, sometimes decisions get made for reasons that might seem to some less than logical. If you're applying some kind of a logic model to that, but there were folks that have had long engagement and long relationships and significant engagement who felt really strongly on all sides of the issue. So it was complex, and it was it was all-consuming. I mean, in terms of energy, and I think Kevin is right that there was. I know, especially right up to the vote, there were some concerns that folks said, well, if this happens, how long is it going to take for us to be the kind of organization that we aspire to be, and what will be lost in that period of time until we're fully up to speed?
Great.
If I could just add on Ken's points, I think that's a good summary, but it's interesting that with all of that, and it was a time-consuming 18-month process, at the end of the day, only 42% of our members with NASPA and ACPA, and this is public information, voted. So, you had a lot of emotion, you had a lot of energy, but less than the majority of members actually voted on the consolidation proposal. And I do think that there was a lot of concern, as Ken points out and Kevin, about size and our ability to move quickly in terms of all the issues that are out there with higher ed, and folks feeling like about lack of leadership opportunities and how that would play out in the end.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I would say, though, Pat, I think that's a good point. Although 42% is a pretty good turnout when you think about association elections on any other issue, whether it's electing leaders or whatever the case might be.
So, Pat, along those lines, one of the criticisms, and this kept going for months after the vote, was that graduate students weren't able to vote at the time. And I think the bylaws have changed that now allow grad students to vote. Do you think it might have tipped the balance back then? I know I'm asking you to
yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of assumptions either way in terms of that. You know, I'm not sure. It could have gone either way, obviously. So I don't know if I can give an absolute opinion about that. And certainly the bylaws, you know, have changed for elections.
Great.
This is Cindy. Could I just jump in one thing, Tony, on that? So, you know, the majority of corporate mergers actually fail. So while we're thinking about context historically, the one thing I think is important to know is that the thing that causes corporate mergers to fail in majority, where you have every kind of resource available to you to make them happen, is cultural conflict. And I don't mean this kind of conflict. I mean where you have two very distinct cultures that have their own organizational DNA, you try and merge those, and in the majority of cases it doesn't work. So we can look at this today and maybe feel badly, but we can also look at this and say, actually, if you look at the world's example, it might not have been the best strategy. So if we're grieving still, perhaps we need to say, you know, sometimes the world works these things out in a way that's good for everyone, and move forward.
So we're getting so many questions on Twitter, and I don't want to ignore our Twitterverse. I'm just going to ask a real simple, maybe it's an easy, maybe it's not so simple question from Ray Gasser, who asks, why do ACPA and NASPA both hold their national conference within the same month of each other?
Wow, that's a good question. It's, you know, that's an historical thing. I think it's been that way. I mean, I've been in this field for 30 years. I think it predates me. And you know, I think it's an interesting question in terms of it becomes more difficult for people to attend both because you can't be away from campus as long. There was a time when many more people attended both. I think that has decreased substantially. I don't think it's ever been examined. I think the only thing we've tried to do, and this has been somewhat informal, but we try to not book over the same dates. But it's a really interesting question to think about, you know, the future where one would be a fall and a spring meeting. I know that the career part of it has driven probably kind of kept it that way. I think both associations pay attention to the career advancement opportunities for the young professionals, and so the March meeting has made sense for that. You know, and until that gets untethered from our conferences, it probably would retain in March. You know, we oftentimes are somewhere about a month apart. ACPA or NASPA can be late March, early April, and one can be early. But it's a great question.
So along the same lines, and it's another question from I'm taking you off the camera, Cindy. From the Twitterverse, as the cost of travel and accommodations continue to rise, it becomes more difficult for folks to justify the expense and time required to attend one, if not two, national conferences. So can we talk about affordability and how might the business model change for national conventions and professional development in the future?
Well, if I could just jump in, you know, we're about to, and this is the second year, I believe, that we have our Navigating with Courage convention in New Orleans, and we're offering a virtual ticket. So somebody can actually be able to participate in over maybe 100 sessions that are chosen, and so that's an opportunity that folks wouldn't necessarily have to travel on site. So I think we're trying, and I'm sure ACPA is doing some of the same things, to offer live streaming and to really see what we can do to use the technology to the advantage when folks cannot travel, as well as really paying attention to our regional conferences and some of our offerings that wouldn't necessarily be a national conference, but that would be enable somebody here in California, like we're here this week, doing a conference to travel here and not be as expensive as coming to the middle of the country. So we're always going to be looking at that and trying to be cognizant of where our members are located and moving sites around regionally, as well as some special topics.
Anyone else?
So Kevin, I would say certainly virtual conferencing is I think going to grow, and first of all, our capability and our ability to do that in a quality way is going to get better. But I think more and more folks will take advantage of that as the quality improves and as they can get a lot of what they want in a less expensive way, and in their terms when they are able to view it. For ACPA, we've moved to a digital platform, so we're calling it ACPA Video on Demand. And the idea is that you can get 24/7 access to professional development and career development opportunities at your desktop or on your mobile device at a time when it's convenient for you. And quite frankly, in a global education market, that's going to be critical. And in particular for us, we can deliver it in 55 languages. So there are some real significant shifts that are happening. And I think when we think about member value around professional and career development, around access to advocacy on particularly important issues that impact us, our work, our students, our institutions, we're going to have to be able to create that at a time that is not time and distance limited. And I think you'd see all kinds of examples in professional associations where it's moving in that direction. That's certainly the effort that we've undertaken in ACPA.
Okay.
Tony, let me just add to that just 1 second. Yeah, I completely agree with everything everybody said. It's an interesting kind of paradox, though. We're all, it's like our campuses, right? We're moving to this hybrid model, and 5-6 years ago, when webinars became sort of the thing, everybody was decrying the end of professional associations. No more meetings. Why have a meeting when you can do all this virtually? And look at what we're doing right here. And yet, when any association, ACPA, NASPA, anybody else, when you ask people to evaluate their annual meetings, the number one thing they say is the best outcome is networking. So despite the fact that we have all these online learning opportunities, which have expanded opportunities, people still want to be face-to-face. In fact, when I look around the higher ed space, many of our associations are operating at record pace right now for attendance, which is kind of contrary to this notion of now everything's available online. So I think it's a bit of a conundrum. I do think that over time that institutional resources will be more and more constrained, and it just simply won't be possible to have as many associations as we have right now, particularly in the student affairs space. I think eventually we're going to have to see some consolidation. I'm not talking about ACPA and NASPA necessarily. I'm even talking about the silo organizations. What Kent and Pat can really afford to have their staff belong to so many different associations. Right. I think the market's going to demand some kind of change there.
Great. So we're going to move on to our next question. Now, there have been a number of significant issues of social justice that have surfaced in the past year alone, from a renewed focus on sexual violence to issues of race in Ferguson. In fact, my fearless co-host, Heather Shea Gasser, did a show last week called Confronting Racism on Campus that, until today, was the highest viewed viewership of the last 12 months. So my question is, what should student affairs be focusing on, and how can we be united? Cindi, you want to kick us off?
Sure. I think it's a real challenge because I bet if you measured the energy and investment on campuses across the country right now around issues that we would have thought of as social justice related issues, but they're becoming primarily issues of compliance. And so it's really hard, I think, to imagine that our field is not going to be consumed by those areas that become the most significant in the market in terms of compliance and tracking. And whether that's, whether you lump that under accessibility, affordability, accountability, outcomes, or whether you're looking at a functional area like sexual assault, we're going to be consumed by that. And so I think the real challenge is that when we have to turn so much energy into one place, then not to neglect what we know are the many, many other issues that are impacting students that are not related to that specific category, and to not fear the criticism of you're not spending enough time on this and around compliance, when in fact you may be spending half of your resources. I know NASPA and ACPA have both spent huge energy on this year. We have a task force established for that. We've been involved in the hearings in D.C., at the White House. But for me, we have a duty and a responsibility to continue to look deeply at all of the issues that are impacting all students across all campuses. And I think it's going to be very challenging. We're going to have to do our best.
Anyone else?
Well, I would just add to that, because I completely agree. I said, if not us, then who? And I think the fact that this falls in student affairs is because other sectors of the campus feel so challenged to deal with it. So, of course, we're going to be at the center of gender-based violence and issues related to diversity and inclusivity, meeting the needs of students with disabilities, learning disabilities. So I think, it's like, if not us, we are the folks. This is what our training is. And Cindi, I completely agree. I think that the danger of this is that it dominates our agenda so much that we don't talk about the other ways in which we contribute to the learning enterprise. But there's no getting away from this. Pat and Kevin both tell you that they spend, and their staff, spend an enormous amount and increasing amounts of time on mental health issues and disability issues and gender-based violence and raceness, all these things. So I think that is our core, and I think it's why student affairs, in some ways, is more vital today than it's ever been. But we also have to be heard on the ways in which we contribute to learning and some of the other factors, and we don't get left out of that. We don't want to simply be the crisis managers on campus. I think that's a really important theme for us.
Yeah,
So, go ahead, Pat.
If I could just jump in, I mean, we have, as everyone has noted, we've had so many what I call unfunded mandates that have come down that have been asked for us to work with and to manage. And every day it sounds like there's, every month another one. And so how do you balance that with also thinking that we still have a lot of work to do on our campuses? Certainly around race, gender, violence, there's work, there's education, and we are the ones that are going to do that. And how do we continue to make sure that we're out front with that we work together, on continuing with, say, for example, cultural competencies and what students should be experiencing and learning on our campuses, in light of Ferguson. I mean, really, really important work. And so I think it's the balancing that takes place, and then it's our leadership and the vice presidents at the institutions working with the professional associations to gather the resources to make sure that those conversations continue to happen.
Tony, if I could add, I agree with everything that's been said, but I think this is one of those areas, and it's got lots of levels and sub-levels, and it's wide and it's deep, but it's one of those places where ACPA and NASPA need to be unified and working on creating an educational experience or educational experiences for students to grapple with these really complex issues. And, we need to be working on these issues. This is a place where it requires all hands on deck, and we really have opportunities, and there's certainly a need. Our institutions are not built to do, in a lot of respects, what we need to do today. We're serving different students. The issues have never been more complex or more important. And there's a lot of work to be done here, and we need to bring our resources to bear together, I think.
Great. So looking toward the next 10 years, next decade, what's one thing each of you might predict as being the issue that starts to affect our field dramatically? Is there one thing?
It's hard.
What are some of the big issues that your staff are dealing with today? Pat and Ken.
I think, really the complex mental health issues. And more students are coming to the campuses, which is a great thing that maybe wouldn't have come before. And so how do we have the resources to make sure that we help them be successful academically on our campuses, and remove and help them work through those obstacles which are hurting potentially their learning and their success. And I think that affects certainly our graduation rates and the way we work with students on our campus. But being a VP for 18 years, I've seen just an incredible, and I'm sure Kent, everybody here says the same thing, and on the it was just an incredible increase in challenging and complex mental health issues. And so I worry about that quite a bit, and I worry about how that affects all of us.
So, Tony, maybe I could say, I think of it as, I think there are some mega trends, if I can use it. John Nesbitt used that word, mega trends, that are really going to have an impact, and that we're, it's hard to predict where things are going to go, but globalization is going to change higher education, or in other countries, tertiary level education, because education is going to be increasingly more mobile and articulated across different educational systems. There's so much integration in economies and world issues and cultures that it's impossible, I think, for it not to have some effect on the way we practice student affairs. But we live in the age of today of access, affordability, attainment, and accountability. And I think it might mean that we have to rethink student affairs in a lot of ways. Like, for example, we may need structures that have fewer rather than more specializations and boundaries. We may need to be thinking about amalgamation or interdisciplinary kinds of models. We may need to think in more complicated ways about our work, creating structures that can accept the complexity of the issues that we're facing. And we're highly specialized today. I remember a time when Cass had about 15 areas, and today it's more than 40. And so while that also is a byproduct of our knowing more and being more rigorous and sophisticated in being able to deliver the services, it also stretches us really wide. So we're going to have to operate from compelling evidence, I think, and we like to say that we do that. But I'm not certain that we do it as well as we need to. And I also wonder, as we think about student learning, for example, is it really possible to separate students and faculty? And do we really need to think about sometimes about what is it that we can do to support faculty in addition to students? Because we know a lot about what creates compelling and intellectually rich educational experiences, and faculty are a big part of that. So I think it just means that we might have to assess institutional needs and think about our values in the name of institutional success, and not necessarily from the vantage point of turf. And I'm afraid that sometimes we do operate out of this is our area or what we do or our expertise, and we may need to rethink some of that citizenship within the academy.
So lots of questions again, lots of chatter on the Twitterverse, and two related questions. The first is from Megan Wyatt, who asks, do you all meet at some point in the year or regularly throughout the year? And related to that, Ray Gasser asks, how do we gather a bigger voice in DC on these unfunded mandates in higher education as two separate organizations?
We do meet. There's a lot of alphabet soup stuff that we can throw at you. But both Cindi and I are part of the Washington Secretariat, which is a consortium of 40 of the top higher ed associations. We also belong to a group called CHIMA, which is more of the business management groups. And then there's a subset of just the student affairs associations. In fact, Cindi wasn't able to be there. We met last week. It's AFA and ASCA and ACUHO, ACUI. I'm missing somebody. NODA. So just the student affairs groups meet twice a year. And that's a place where we talk about public policy issues. We talk about some of these themes and ways in which we can collaborate. And that's, I think, an important piece. And when we think about collaboration, it's not just between ACPA and NASPA. It's really the larger cohort of student affairs associations. So I think that's that is a place. And in terms of voice in Washington, I think Cindi and I are both hard at work trying to, either together or in our own opportunities to not represent our association. I almost never talk about NASPA when I'm out. I talk about student affairs. And that's really the more important thing. How can we position student affairs within the academy? How can we represent us in key with key stakeholders that help the resources or challenges that we're facing in the day-to-day work that both Ken and Pat do? So, I think there's a lot of that going on. It's tough sledding, right? We're not a presidential association. We're not the big six in DC. So sometimes access and voice are challenging, but we work pretty hard at that within the avenues we have. And Cindy's been doing a lot of amazing work already in the little time she's had to exercise our voice.
Yeah, go ahead, Cindi.
No, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No. I just think it's a really important position that we have to take. We have to be the voice of student affairs and make sure that our voices are heard. And so, I mean, the strides that we have taken are much more improved than where we were even 2 or 3 years ago. But it's always working together. And if there's something that comes up quickly, I know and I'm confident that there's a number of the Kevin and Cindi and counterparts that get together and talk about it. And so we're always monitoring what the trends are going to be and thinking about how those trends are going to affect the work on our campuses.
Some people may not know that we jointly participate in something called the Public Policy Consortium. And so that's, in effect, an individual who's listening in D.C. at all of these meetings and bringing it back to us. That's actually how our joint statement on gun control and some others were investigated early on. But one other piece that I think is important for us to know, the number of major funders, corporations and foundations that are influencing public policy in D.C. has become really quite small. They are very large, and there are very few of them. And so another piece of work that we're doing now that may not have been so common in the past is actual work in conversation and dialogue with those major funders, because they tend to tilt the view and the slant that's happening in D.C. So the Lumina Foundation is a great example, the Gates Foundation, and I know Kevin and I both have been working a lot in those areas as well to advocate around the specific field of student affairs that not be ignored when they're making major recommendations to their government partners.
So I know you could all talk about for an hour the upcoming initiatives and convention plans that you have over the next few months and years, but could you all take a minute or two to talk about some upcoming initiatives that might be of interest to our audience?
Sure.
Without giving away trade secrets, I suppose.
Who wants to go first? Kevin, you want to go?
Sure. I mean, I'd highlight two things that I think that are in the space that we just talked about. We hired a really bright online learning specialist to take the same principles that are being used in online learning in higher education and college setting to employ them in the association space. And so we're really working on developing curriculum and courses, online courses that through our online learning community, which got launched back in December, to try to really advance some of the professional development opportunities. The challenge with webinars is they're 1 hour and they're good, but we really believe there's an opportunity for us to deepen that. And then I think I know we're both working in the international space, but we have sort of some significant board activity related to our international activities to identify actually now new regions globally, and we're investing both staff and board time to do what Kent has talked about, is to really find ways to broaden the profession of student affairs more globally. What's happened globally is that higher education is rising as the middle class has risen, and so 10 years ago, places that had nothing resembling student affairs now have student affairs, but without the training that we have. And so I think looking at that as an opportunity, it's a big world, obviously, so you can't tackle the whole thing. But I think those are two places where we have put a lot of board and staff time. I'll just mention those two off the top.
I could also mention too that to kind of piggyback on that would be our civic and community engagement initiatives and our conference. A couple of years ago we had probably 100, 150. We predict 700 this year in New Orleans. We're also doing a lot more work around community college initiatives, and so we had a community college summit in the fall. And so, given all the emphasis and certainly Obama's thoughts about community colleges and what he talked about last night, I think this is important to make sure that we're serving the needs of our colleagues at the community colleges.
Cindy, Kent?
Cindy, you want to lead off or you want me to?
I think I'll let you lead off because you've got it.
You all heard that first right here, right? So there are a number of things. There's a couple of task forces that we put together this year, in addition to the Joint Task Force on Professional Competencies, which is doing some really important work. We have a digital technology task force that's really trying to look at socially responsible and educationally impactful ways that we can incorporate digital technology into practice, thinking of it both as a learning tool and also as a way to help students socially integrate and engage with one another. And they certainly understand that well. The question is whether we understand it well enough to be able to really participate in a meaningful way. And to really think beyond traditional student affairs practice and think more about our work as educators in higher education. So that's really important work. We're excited about that. We have a sexual violence task force as well, and that group is doing some really good work and really important work around education prevention. There's a lot that's being done around compliance and interpreting campus-based response, but there probably needs to be more in the way of behavioral change. And so that group's doing some good work for us, and we're looking forward to seeing what will come out of that. I mentioned ACPA Video on Demand. That's our new digital platform. We think that might transform the way we're able to deliver career and professional development opportunities. And we have an interesting piece that's attached to that we're calling My Portfolio, which is a digital portfolio tool that allows us to sort of serve professionals cradle to grave in terms of tracking and making meaning from their being intentional, if I could say that, about their professional development. We also, because we have a lot of new professionals and graduate students, in fact a significant percentage of our membership is in a category, we have a new mentoring, or we've expanded our mentoring programs, now have a digital tool that we're using that will allow us to reach a lot more of our members and to connect them in meaningful ways on an ongoing basis other than just at convention and at times when we're face-to-face. And we think that's an important contribution as well. And, we've really doubled down, I think, in terms of our commitment to research and scholarship in the field, and recognizing that those are that's really our roots in ACPA. And candidly, we still have a lot of work to do in bridging theory to practice, and new theories and new evidence is being developed all the time that needs to be exported into a practice environment. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done there intentionally, and we've got a number of activities going on there. Cindi could talk a little bit, I hope she will talk a little bit about our work around constructing inclusion.
I think that it was interesting. I was listening to everybody. I was thinking the biggest shift for me that's coming in this 10 years, we're living with the first generation of students right now who had the complete capacity for global collaboration when they entered college. And they can connect with anyone they want anywhere unless there is an artificial barrier imposed by that country. And it has raised the consciousness of young people all around the world around issues of human dignity and human rights. And so I think for us, at least in the short time that I have been here, and certainly in the context of Ferguson and the events around that, I've had a real awareness of the deep desire and need of students and their mentors, whether those are faculty or community organizers or other people, to really connect around these issues and then to see these translate into positive change on their campuses. And when they don't feel that or don't see that, there is a breakdown culturally. So one of the great things that we got to do, or the universe in some way conspired for us to get to do, Kent is the Vice President of Student Affairs at St. Louis University, which is right next to the Ferguson community. And so we used our new on-demand platform to go into that environment and interview. We did about 15 hours of interviews with students, faculty, administration, practitioners, and community organizers, really backing into what happens in a campus community in that type of experience, and particularly people in student affairs. And then how do you come through that and out of that, not just in a state of complete exhaustion and hoping it never happens again, but in fact shifting in terms of campus climate. So I really think there's going to be more demand on us, particularly in the United States, around those issues and how we're actually dealing with the very deep issues of racism, sexism, homophobia. And we didn't mention, Kevin, we're doing this really cool thing funded by the Ford Foundation with the Interfaith Youth Corps and Ibu Patel. We're doing in partnership to look specifically at the issue of what happens when religious diversity breaks down on campuses. I think that's going to be a big part of our work, and I hope we're all up for it. I think we are.
A trending question or theme keeps coming up on Twitter seems to be around graduate students. So what do each of your organizations, what's your interaction, how do graduate students distinguish between the two? And Stacey Oliver connects, and she said, I'm really interested in the idea of loyalty to professional organizations. I've experienced it, but would never be able to pinpoint why. And I've often found that whatever convention or whatever association your boss goes to tends to be the convention and the association that you call your family. Anyone want to talk about young professionals and grads?
Well, I'll share that. We from a NASPA standpoint, we've had, we have more graduates, with 3,500, 4,000 graduate students. So it's a big population for us. We have a number of articulated programs that try to address that. We have a full-time staff member who we just hired to work with grad students and young professionals. And the challenge, I think, is if you're a grad student is, ACPA has a set of scholarly journals. NASPA has 3 referee journals. All the literature. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine how you, as a grad student, sometimes kind of get by without access to both. I think that's often challenging. I think just from how you manage writing papers. But I think that both associations, I think, pay a lot of attention to the young professionals and grad students in their organization, because that's the future. And while NASPA has, we have, the lifespan, almost 15,000 members, got all aspects covered, which has its own set of challenges. It is really critical that we provide a voice and opportunities for professional development for the graduate student members of both associations.
Yeah. So. A couple things come to mind. I mean, one is in ACPA we have actually an organization within ACPA that specifically for graduate students, and so there are opportunities for graduate students to be involved and to do some self-governing, which I think is important. It's we're always looking for ways to try to provide real, authentic leadership and engagement opportunities within ACPA for graduate students, and I think that's a big part of the learning. I mean, part of the learning is just how to be a part of a professional community, and so we provide an important opportunity there. I think we have to really serve the needs of faculty, because if we serve the needs of faculty, we have a much better chance of serving the needs of graduate students. So these are interdependent or interrelated communities, and understanding how they work together and what the relationships are is really important. But Cindi always reminds me that that particularly when we're starting out in our careers, and a lot of these folks are younger in age, and that doesn't necessarily mean all are, and I don't want to get painted into that corner, but many are, and I think those are the times in our lives when we're confirming our own core values.
Yeah.
We're really trying to understand and decide what culture or what communities and their cultures do we really want to be a part of. And so really paying attention to what that culture means to graduate students is how we hang on to graduate students as new professionals or new faculty and stay with them and support them throughout their career. So, it really starts with, we have in ACPA, it's, one vote, one voice, or one voice, one vote. And so, we really try to pay attention to what graduate students think about the future of the field and what they think about student affairs practice, and give them real intentional opportunities to be a part of policy development, new program development, and other forms of volunteer leadership within the association. I think that's really important.
I mean, the reality is, as Ken says, graduate students are the future of our profession. And both associations, rightfully so, have to invest resources into the professional development of graduate students and their support. And we have to make sure that it continues to be a high priority.
I'm not looking for an answer on this one, but Ray Gasser is on fire on Twitter right now, so I just want to point this out. So I came from NERSA into the associations, and Ray's question was, how do associations welcome new members into what often feels like an inner circle? And as leadership, I'm just going to share with you that I felt that way. I felt it was difficult to break in to and find my place within both associations. So just something to consider moving forward. And we have just time for one last question. It's probably the question that has come up most often, and it's fairly simple. Is there ever a time in the future that you foresee consolidation conversation being revisited, and what would need to change for that to happen?
I would say time. I think it's. I think the resources invested, the organizational effort, and still residual kind of tension or bad feelings about the process. I think it's too soon to revisit it. I have thought all along, and I said earlier, I think eventually the market's going to demand some consolidation of associations that may involve ACPA and NASPA. I don't know, but I think there's some inevitability about it. But I think it's a fairly long way off at this point.
This is Cindi. I've been thinking about this a lot because I came from an association in corporate America that had 21,000 members. So, if you combine NASPA and ACPA today, that's about the size we would be.
Right.
And I was thinking about the long and deliberate process, almost 100-year existence of that profession and their association, and the level of deliberation, intention, investment. There were a lot of things that went into that to make that work. But what's really interesting is it still was basically 3 associations in one. It was sort of like a reverse amalgamation. If you compared it to us, they had a group that were the researchers, so scholars. They had a group that were young professionals coming into profession, leading toward their certifications. And they had a whole other group that we might think of as mid-management, senior level in the profession. And they actually had their own conferences within conferences because of the size constraints and the voice, the need for voice. Will it never happen? I don't think anyone can say never. And I really think the ultimate determination of that will be when the members say of the respective organizations, this makes sense for us. Maybe that's the most important thing in everything we do anyway. So.
Sure. Pat, Kent?
Well, you know, it is. I mean, I think because we're one field,
Yeah.
you know, that the likeliness that the conversation and the questions are going to continue to occur or emerge, I think, is a good bet. But I agree with Cindi that, you know, it's hard to predict when. I mean, timing's always really. I mean, if we could do that, we'd be superb as leaders, because we'd always be in front of every issue. But I do think if it happens, it's going to be an imperative of the members. The members will make it a mandate or an imperative, and so it's more likely, I think, to come from the grassroots to some extent. Because I think, you know, what happens is leaders then move, once a decision's been made, leaders move forward with plans. They say, look, here are our values, here's where we can really be world class in what we're doing, here's really what the field needs and how we can meet those needs. And you mobilize as leaders and you put plans in place and you execute those plans, and so your focus is really on executing those plans. And that's what the members would expect of you as an elected person. So I really believe when the time comes, it will emerge from within the groups or within the associations themselves.
Pat, final words?
I would certainly concur, but in the same right now, I think that the time is not right, and at the same time, I think it's really important to continue to have great conversations and work together as two esteemed organizations and work on things that are important to both of our members. And to the extent that we continue to do that, and we do, I think everybody here has great relationships and wouldn't ever hesitate to pick up the phone to talk and reach out. And I know the leaders, certainly the ones that, you know, Frank Lamas will continue to be chair in March, and will continue that real feeling of collaboration.
Great. Well, we are at the end of our time. I really sincerely thank all of you for taking the time. Everyone's all over the country doing things this week and really getting into some of the issues and taking so many of the questions from Twitter. Perhaps we can have this conversation once a year and bring our organizations, if not other organizations, into the conversation. I will be returning again in February. Heather Shea Gasser will be back February 4th for a show on essay search, job placement, and career development with guests Patrick Love, Mallory Bauer, and Antonio P. And I'll be back later in February to talk about the subject of positive psychology and student affairs practice. Please find me on Twitter for more information and details of upcoming guests. Until then, my name is Tony Doody, and thank you, guests, and thanks again for watching. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tony.
Really appreciate it.
Bye.